and just some other things around administering and day-to-day things. Again, I'm not going to talk about anything that's future. So safe harbor-wise, I think we're fine. So categories, just basic command line tools. So Linux folks in here? Linux, Unix? How many of you use GUIs for doing things?
Use what?
But command line? Command line files? All right, good. So we'll talk about command lines. Yeah, Baron, I know. That's right. Something you find in your yard, I don't know. Look at some of what kind of internal metadata databases do we have? What kind of internal schemas do we have? We will touch on graphical environments that are available for MySQL. Touch a little bit on backup and recovery. Go over monitoring and management, and just a smidgen on some of the stress testing tools that are available that are commonly used for MySQL. Yes?
These are all going to be email tools, right? Yes.
They're going to be made available somehow.
Yes.
And I did include links in here, so when you get the slide deck, you'll be able to use the links to go straight to the documentation instead of doing hunting and pecking. It's gotten better. I mean, our online documentation is actually really good. A lot of information. So what client programs are available? So, again, we were initially developed way back when in '95 when MySQL was written by one guy needing a database. He actually did his first development on Solaris. So the first release of MySQL, what was going to eventually become MySQL, was on Solaris. That means going over to Linux was fairly easy. So there's lots of command line tools, of course, available to administer MySQL. And back then, I doubt he had any kind of GUI management or tool or anything to work with the database. So if you're familiar with Oracle and SQL Plus, or you're familiar with SQL Server and Sybase, use what ISQL or I forgot the exact name of the command line tool. The equivalent for MySQL is MySQL command line tool. So that is, you type it in, you get right into a SQL client, you can type in your SQL statements, and you're on your merry way to starting to work with MySQL at the SQL layer. From an administration standpoint, there's a MySQL admin tool. Start and stop the database. You can create user passwords, various things from an administrative standpoint. I don't use it an awful lot. I tend to just use MySQL where I need to. And if I need to shut things down, I kill it or do my own thing. But I don't run production databases either, so I have limited experience in that regard. MySQL check is specific to my ISAM tables. So if you look at the architecture of MySQL, my ISAM is the one storage engine that you cannot get rid of in MySQL. Every other storage engine, if you wanted to compile your own code, compile your own binaries, you can eliminate every other storage engine within MySQL except for my ISAM. It's the one that's needed because the MySQL database, metadata repository, are my ISAM tables. And don't try to change it to InnoDB. Bad things happen if you do. MySQL dump is, how do I get data out of the database? How do I create a backup, a simple backup? How do I dump the schema? So there's options to MySQL dump that will just let you look at the schema and dump the schema out for a database. I think it's pretty useful. There's another option that will, by default, MySQL will dump all databases to standard out, but to one file, one big file. But there's an option that you can give MySQL dump to say, I want the table SQL in one file, in a separate file, and I want the data in another file. So that's, I like that because generally when I start playing or manipulating data at the table level and I want to move things, sometimes I don't want to have to look at one big giant file. I want to look at just the data file instead. So there's a lot of options for MySQL dump. Okay, so how do you bring it back in? So there's a MySQL import command. That you take an ASCII file, delimited with any kind of delimiter because there's options you can set, let you bring it back in. So I somebody asked the question of how many people were using MySQL, and I guess there was a lot of new folks with MySQL, just starting to use the database. One thing you should know and probably get familiar with, because they're great time savers, is MySQL has a lot of ways of showing you metadata without typing in SQL statements. So if I want to look at, let's say, the description of a table, I can use describe, basically describe table, and it'll give me the columns of the table. Or I can do show create table, and it'll show me the create table statement with what engine it's been created with and all the indexes and everything. There's a command called show databases. It'll show me all my databases in my instance. There's another command called show tables. That'll show me all the tables in my database. So there's a lot of shortcuts for letting you look and see what you actually have. There's also a MySQL show client that'll let you do a lot of those same things without starting up the MySQL client to do it. So I guess for scripting and things like that, you could just use the MySQL show to look at different table aspects. Yes?
A question. If I cannot log in use MySQL, for example,
Right.
can I just see some database status using MySQL admin? Like if
You can see some, but you would need to know a user account to use for MySQL admin also. So
yeah.
if you,
but if MySQL reach the memory limitation, I cannot log into, I cannot connect to MySQL. So can I just run MySQL admin to see the MySQL status or to see the process?
Right. So our question was, if for some reason you can't use the MySQL client to log into the database to look for things, can you use the MySQL admin client to look at the status of the database?
And the process or pure process.
And the process list and things like that.
Yeah.
The answer is yes, but you still need a valid user to be able to do that. So
I think she's saying like there's so many connections that it can't use the regular client to connect.
Well, if that's the case, there is, in MySQL, there's always one connection saved for the root account, for anybody with the super user privilege.
I use the root, but I cannot log in.
We should probably talk about this offline, but yeah, you can look at the status, you can look at the processes running using MySQL admin. The answer is yes, you can use that for those types of things. But you would still need a valid user to do it.
I know.
That's, okay. Well, we can talk about it offline and see and get more details to what's really happening. MySQL SLAP is basically it's a testing tool that we include in the server. I don't want to say bare bones. I mean, it allows you to enter in and let you run a repeated command with a number of threads, start up 10 threads and run this SQL statement to start getting some performance metrics out of the server. So for starting up and the daemon processes that run for the server process, MySQL-D is the server. MySQL-D, service daemon. There are various scripts that ship with the product for starting up the server. And this is I'm talking primarily Unix, Linux systems. For Windows, we generally set it up as a service, a net service. And that's how you would start and stop the MySQL database using the Windows conventions. But on Linux systems, MySQL Safe is probably one of the most common ones that's used to start up the server. MySQL Safe will start up an Angel process too that'll watch the MySQL daemon, and if it fails, try to restart it. There's a mysql.server script that if you want to start up the server on boot on a Linux system, that's generally the script that you would use to start and stop the server. And then last is MySQL multi if you want to start up multiple instances of MySQL on the same machine. You can use multi. I don't think that one's used nearly as much as all the others. So MySQL has the MySQL database for storing some metadata content, for storing user privileges, and those types of things. There's also an information schema database, which is an ANSI-compliant metadata repository for MySQL. So here's a way you can use SQL to look and see what tables you have, what table structures, what engines are created, how many rows are in a table, what databases are out there, various privileges, those types of things. So this is just an ANSI standard way to get information from the server, to get metadata information from the server. One of the things that was added with 5.5, so 5.5 was, I would say the best release MySQL has ever had. It's a very good release. One of the things that was added in 5.5 was this performance schema. So a complaint against MySQL for those that are coming from, if you're coming from Oracle and other databases, that you can get gobs of detail on, down to very low levels what an SQL statement is doing. When they come over to MySQL, they're kind of shocked that they don't have that same level of detail. Well, performance schema is starting to get us to that same level of detail. So for an SQL statement, performance schema will get you down to what locks are being held, who's holding locks, how long it's taking, from a spin cycle for those locks to free. Very detailed information on what's actually happening at the SQL level. It's primarily geared for probably support and people that are very, very knowledgeable with MySQL to go in and look at. But we are starting to expose views into the performance schema that we'll be adding to the Enterprise Monitor product. So the monitoring tool for MySQL, we're going to start adding views to look into to the performance schema database for folks. Yes?
What about monitoring? You have, for example, table level, row level, user level auditing available?
So the question is, what type of auditing do we have available at the database? So today, generally the way you would audit MySQL is we have there's a general log for MySQL that you can set up. The general log logs all connection activity, all SQL statements that are happening at the server. If you really needed auditing, that's the only way today that you could get all that information out of MySQL. The binary log will hold transactional data, transactional statements. So anything that changes the data. What's tougher to get out of there is who was the user that changed the data. The general log will show you connection information, and there's an ID that tracks through, so anything that ID does is associated back to that user. In 5.5, there's an auditing framework that is available. So this is a way to basically create plugins or modules that can be plugged into the MySQL server to do auditing. So we're working on providing a module to do auditing that will tie into Oracle's Audit Vault product with 5.5. So I don't know the release date of that, but that'll do true auditing. Give you some profiling and provisioning capabilities within the server. So that's the longer term answer is we're going to use the auditing framework, and you'll be able to do true auditing, and then set up profiles and look and see who's changed it and when they've changed it and that type of thing. So the performance schema is a great addition to the server, because then we can start getting some meat out of what's actually happening at the server level for a SQL statement, and start doing real tuning at a low level. The caveat here is that you need to, even if you're running 5.5, it doesn't get created automatically. You have to put it in the configuration file that you want to create the performance schema. I will say on a day-to-day basis, you probably wouldn't be looking at it. If you run into an issue and need support to come in, they might start looking at what's going on with the performance schema. All right, so all you command line folks that don't want to hear about GUIs, close your ears, go to sleep, because I'm going to talk about one right now. So MySQL workbench. I talked to a few folks, and somebody's using Toad for doing GUI development. People familiar with Toad, so there's a version available for MySQL. On the Windows front, there's a tool called CLi that's actually fairly popular. Also another good GUI tool for MySQL. If you look on the commercial side, people like Embarcadero, Irwin have modeling tools that can work with MySQL. Well, we have Workbench. The great thing about Workbench is that it's a data modeler. So you can do database modeling through Workbench against MySQL servers. You can do schema comparisons against what you have in your model and what's existing on the server. It has a schema. It has an SQL editor. So if you want to just fire up a window and start typing in SQL commands and get the result sets back in a tabular format, it's in Workbench also. And it also has an administration file. So I can do administering for MySQL. Start and stop the database, change configuration variables, set up user accounts, all that kind of stuff. Initiate backups, all from within Workbench. So it's an all-encompassing, multi-platform, graphical user interface. For the crowd, the Windows crowd that is graphical by default and expects this kind of tool, we've gotten great feedback on Workbench. So I think if you can satisfy the folks coming from SQL Server and the environment that Microsoft gives SQL Server users and give them a comparable tool for MySQL, you've done a good job. And I think this team has done a great job of Workbench. So there is a SQL development environment, an IDE, I guess. It's got syntax highlighting, color syntax highlighting. It's got simple ways to add what tables you want to select, those types of things. It's not a true drag and drop, build your SQL statement. You do have to know how to type SQL. You will get result sets back in a grid that you can edit, and you can change the data and feed it back in. So again, fairly robust SQL development environment. This Workbench actually started out as a data modeling tool. The guy that wrote it based it off his past experience in writing a tool called DB Designer, and this was his next iteration of writing a database modeling tool for MySQL. So it's got some great modeling capabilities. Like I said, it's got a great way to compare what's in your current schema in your model against what's in the database and show you the differences. It's got a way to push down models, to extract models. It can do reverse engineering of an existing database. So if you all of a sudden find out that you're responsible for these 5 MySQL databases and you don't know MySQL, this is a great way to see what's in those databases and start getting your handle around what you need to do and how to manage it. And a full-blown administration client. I am generally a command line person also. I mean, a long while back, I've forgotten most of it, but I used to do development on Xenix platforms way back when. So I know a little bit about command lines, but if I'm going to set up user accounts and things like that, I find this administrator an easier way for me to do it, because I don't have to remember the grant syntax for SQL and what goes where, and if it's on or to or whatever, this table, this person. So the server administrator is a great way to fire it up, create user accounts. There's some graphs that will show you like connections, number of connections, database activities, and basic server graphs that are available. It's got rudimentary role support. So is everyone familiar with database roles? The ability to assign to use one or more roles and have them log in as that role and grant privileges based on that role. Well, it's not in the server yet. I was leading you down a path and then just shut off the path. But it's not in the server, and I say yes, so we're working on it. But the administrator will let you basically set up the same capabilities for user accounts. If you go through, it's limited role support, but it's there. I'll just say that. You can also import and export data using this. So basically, it'll initiate a MySQL dump for you to dump out the data, and it'll also do an import of that data. One of the keys to Workbench, and one of the design goals, was to make it extensible without replacing the whole product. So they wanted to set up the ability for folks, anyone, the community, to write plugins for it. You can write, if you know Python or Lua, another scripting language, you can write plugins for Workbench to do various things that you would need to do with the schema, but in particular with table data or whatever. So some of the plugins that we've been writing and making available is the ability to copy databases to do index checks, to set up replication. So some common tasks that are done in MySQL circles with databases. We're starting to write plugins and have them available through Workbench. There's an ongoing index you can look at where people are adding. There's people adding new ones on a fairly regular basis. So just something to be aware of, that it is extensible. It doesn't lock you into one way of doing things necessarily. The other thing to know about Workbench is that there are two versions. There's a GPL version, so under the GPL license, and we also have a commercial version. So for both those folks that have support contracts with MySQL, then they have access to what we call the standard edition. So there's not a lot of differences, but there are some pretty key differences between them. The real goal behind the standard edition is to give those professional, bigger shops maybe that are running MySQL that want some extra help from a day-to-day basis on, in this case, on reporting on what's in the database, to provide a nice, pretty printout of a database schema. So there's some ways to do documentation of an existing schema through here and get a nice, pretty HTML report. The other things it can do in the standard edition that's not available in the community is there's some validation that you can run against a schema. Some validation checks looking for consistency errors, looking for relationships, making sure that foreign key relationships are set up correctly. I don't remember if it was a plugin or if it was through this that we'll go through, and I think it might be through a plugin, and lets you, an existing schema that doesn't have any kind of referential integrity set up, will go through and look for common fields within parent-child, what should be parent-child tables, and maybe suggest some foreign key relationships for you. I think it's in a plugin. I don't think it's through the validation. But the goal behind this is to be able to validate what's out there and just give you some tools to help validate your schema.
I had a quick question about that. We use that Perl script, the MySQL performance tuning script, quite a bit to see if there's like tables that are fragmented. Is there something like that in Workbench as well, like to, sort of?
Okay, fragmented how?
Well, I mean, like we use a tool. It's MySQL it's like a open source performance analysis tool that a lot of people run. It's like a Perl script.
Right.
And then we see, it basically gives us some metrics on the how the tables are set up in database, just to see, if things are sort of out of whack or not, or what things we need to change, and comparably to the data set in the myCNF file and that kind of.
Oh, okay. Off the top of my head, I don't know.
Right.
It may be that one. It may be inherent within Workbench that you can do it or not. I don't remember, or if it's a plugin. Yes.
Repeat the question, please.
Oh, so he was asking if Workbench can basically go through a schema and do some type of fragment analysis or table analysis against what's in the configuration file.
Well, yeah, which one? Just to give you some, not like SQL Optimizer, but just give you like some changes that you should implement, or I don't know to.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't remember seeing anything like that.
Wouldn't that be the explain?
Well, explain, yeah,
Yeah.
Explain is a little different. It's just looking at a particular optimizer path or optimizer choice for a SQL statement. This is a little more general and just looking at the configuration of the existing database and what's in the config file and see if there's any optimizations you can do from within there. I don't believe there's a Workbench plugin. What's that?
The advisors?
The advisors would go a long way. So the Enterprise Monitor would go a long way towards pointing out holes or problems within your MySQL instances. That's a good point. The earthquake's affecting me, so that's mine. So backup and recovery. There are, you guys know the challenges of backup. I think the biggest challenge is how fast can I recover. So MySQL backup tools. The default one that's been around for years, that still a lot of people use, is MySQL dump. It provides a logical backup of the database. It's easy, simple. The backup file it creates is an ASCII dump, so it's easy to look and see your data and if it's worked. There are we do have MySQL Enterprise Backup, which is an online transactional binary backup of InnoDB tables and InnoDB databases. The preferred way, definitely, to back up InnoDB and restore InnoDB databases. Other ways people use it is, again, Tony had mentioned, in replication. A lot of people set up a replication server, and they back up from the replication server. Cold backup, offline, everybody knows how to do that. Snapshots, file system snapshots seems to be another pretty common option. So MySQL dump, again, advantages. It's great for small databases and for test databases, and for, you want to quickly dump a schema out and get all the data and move it over to another server and import it. It's great for doing that. Like I said, it's great for doing a logical backup of the server. So what you're going to get is the table schema, and then you're going to get a bunch of insert statements to let you recreate that table. So it's really easy to see if things are correct, and it's really easy to go and modify the table if you need to, change the engine type and do a re-import. So in that case, it's very good. The disadvantages is that it's a logical backup. So on a big database, you don't want to be necessarily dumping out a 100 gig database to a 100 gig file. Because it's going to use database processing time to do that. It's basically going to run SQL statements to dump out the data. So a lot of times that's not really what you want to do on a day-to-day database on your production. A day-to-day thing on your production databases. And there's no real consistency. You can get consistency out of it, but it takes table locks to do it. So it has to lock tables to be able to do a consistent backup. Again, not something you really want to do on a production database. Replication, great. You can offload the backup to a replication server. You can use a replication server as a backup. The problem is that a replication server backup doesn't protect you from bad things happening to the master. So if a bad thing's happening to the master, you can replicate it right to the slave, so there goes your backup. So that's not necessarily the best way to do it. The good thing is that it's a quick way to recover if you can set it up and things are working right. Snapshots, generally fast, at least from what I've seen. It's a feature of Linux, it's a feature of Solaris. Most operating systems or file system drivers will let you do snapshots. There's some disadvantages with doing snapshots that are not specific to MySQL. They're just disadvantages of doing snapshots in general. So MySQL Enterprise Backup. This used to be a separate, so InnoDB, the creators of InnoDB wrote a backup tool way back when. I don't remember, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, I don't remember when he wrote it. But way back when, he wrote a backup tool to do transaction-safe backups of InnoDB tables without taking locks. It used to be called IB Backup. You would purchase it separately from, at the time, Innobase, which is the company that developed InnoDB. Oracle bought Innobase in 2005. So Oracle's owned the transactional storage engine for MySQL since 2005. Done some good things, made a lot of changes, made a lot of improvements. That's where the plugin came from. That's where all the work in 5.5 came from. So they've done, even before Oracle owned MySQL proper, they've had the transactional storage engine in their control, and they've done great things with it. But so the quick history is that this used to be a separate tool. It used to be purchased from Innobase or Oracle per server. It is now part of the enterprise subscription for MySQL. So if you get support for MySQL for your databases, and you have an enterprise subscription, you have the enterprise backup tool. So this is a transactional safe, no locking, fast binary backup of InnoDB tables. The preferred way to back up InnoDB tables. The disadvantages, yeah, it requires some planning. But it would be one way to back up using a supported tool, something that